We need to get divorced, Yufan. My rolling pin never paused mid-motion. I pressed the dough flat, pinched filling into the center, folded 5 meat pleats along the edge, and set the finished dumpling onto the ceramic tray without lifting my eyes to meet his face. Every small, repetitive kitchen movement was deliberate, rooted in a core motive I'd nurtured for a full decade. I would not beg, scream, or plead for his attention the way I'd watched countless wronged wives collapse into hysterics. I'd spent 47 years absorbing every unspoken slight, every unacknowledged sacrifice, every time he took my labor for granted. If this day finally arrived, I would let the words land without a single performative display of grief. My internal state shifted from quiet, long-held sorrow to cold, steady resolve the second the divorce sentence left his mouth. I'd waited for him to voice this exact thought for 10 years, ever since I'd uncovered hidden photos of his former subordinate tucked in his desk drawer back in 2014, yet I never once confronted him, choosing to log every sacrifice and financial contribution in a locked notebook instead of picking fights. I wiped flour from my apron with 2 slow swipes and stepped out of the kitchen to sit across from him on the sofa, my tone as flat and unhurried as if we were debating grocery prices rather than ending nearly 5 decades of marriage. Fine. We can file tomorrow morning at 9 at the Civil Affairs Bureau. Tao froze mid-sentence, the lengthy list of pre-planned grievances he'd spent days drafting dying unspoken on his tongue. His eyes darted back and forth, confusion warring with faint guilt across his features. He'd spent hours mentally mapping out how to soothe a distraught, clinging wife. He prepared excuses about midlife loneliness, gentle comparisons of how younger, softer companions understood his stress, even a half-hearted offer of partial pension support to placate my supposed tantrum. He had never accounted for me accepting the divorce without a single argument. You're just going to agree that easily? He stumbled over the line, voice thinner than he intended. I folded my hands in my lap, gaze level and unwavering on his. What would be the point of fighting over something you've already made up your mind to do? I won't beg you to stay. But there's one non-negotiable condition before we sign any paperwork. Tao leaned forward slightly, regaining a fraction of his bureaucratic arrogance now that the initial shock faded. The house and savings will split evenly per marital property law. My monthly pension stays mine. Your retirement funds remain yours. No disputes over our adult children. They're both fully independent. That split is acceptable to me. I confirmed, no trace of hesitation in my voice. But before we sign, you have to state clearly in front of our son Tao Lei that the separation is your choice, not mine. You pursued another woman of your own free will. I refuse to be painted as the difficult, unreasonable spouse to all our family and neighbors later on. Color flooded Tao's cheeks in a rush of embarrassed anger. His entire identity for decades rested on community prestige. Retired District Education Bureau Director, respected calligraphy instructor, celebrated veteran cadre at every city retiree gathering. The thought of publicly admitting he'd abandoned his long-term wife for a new companion terrified him far more than the loss of shared assets. You're being unreasonable to demand public confession, he huffed, crossing his arms tight over his chest. This private family matter doesn't need broadcast to everyone we know. I stood from the sofa, apron still draped loosely over my hips, and nodded toward the wall clock I'd purchased secondhand 30 years prior, the potted jasmine I'd tended alone for 16 years sitting on the windowsill behind it. Every item in this 80-square-foot apartment carried my labor and my money, yet he'd spent 47 years acting as if the entire household existed solely to serve his comfort. The choice to cheat and leave was public enough when you attended community calligraphy events with her every week that I only asked for equal transparency for myself. We'll finalize the legal split tomorrow, or we don't proceed at all. Tao had no counter-argument left. He stared at the floor, jaw tight with suppressed frustration, while I retreated back to the kitchen to finish rolling dumpling wrappers, the rhythm of my movements a quiet anchor amid the seismic shift of my 47-year life. My daughter's shout Ching lingered in the dining room doorway, clutching a bowl of cooled congee, watching the exchange unfold with wide, stunned eyes. She'd grown up witnessing me cater to every one of Tao's needs, never once seeing me stand firm against his demands, and the sudden, unyielding version of her mother left her completely baffled. Mom, are you sure you don't want to talk this through more? Xiao whispered, stepping forward cautiously. I glanced over my shoulder, softening my tone only for her. No trace of the cold resolve I'd used to address Tao. I've thought about this for a full decade, Qing. Every decision I make right now is calculated, not impulsive. There's nothing left to negotiate. Xiao set the congee bowl down on the dining table, her knuckles white around the ceramic handle, unable to process how the quiet, endlessly accommodating woman she'd known her whole life had transformed overnight. She'd only seen the surface of our marriage, me cooking, cleaning, tending to his family, sacrificing my own income to cover every household cost. Never the private notebooks I'd filled documenting every unacknowledged sacrifice, every hidden betrayal I'd uncovered years prior. Major truth setup beat, 1183 words. The next morning, I transformed my appearance completely, trading frumpy houseware for tailored knitwear, polished pearl studs, and muted rose lipstick. Tao's visible shock reinforces how he'd mentally reduced me to a disposable domestic worker, blind to my hidden sense of self-worth and long-term financial planning. I rose at 8 a.m. the following day, long before Tao stirred in the spare study he'd claimed as his private workspace. I pulled a burgundy wool cardigan from the back of my closet, an item I'd purchased years prior for rare personal outings, only worn once before, and paired it with a crisp gray collar blouse and straight-leg dark trousers. I ran a soft curling iron through my gray-black hair to add gentle volume, clipped tiny pearl earrings to my lobes, and dab a thin layer of Settled Matte lipstick across my lips. No heavy, attention-grabbing pigment, just enough to erase the exhausted, washed-out look I'd intentionally carried for years around Tao's relatives and friends. My motive for the intentional glow was simple. I wanted him to see exactly what he'd spent 47 years taking for granted before he legally severed our partnership. I didn't dress for another man's attention. I dressed to honor the version of myself I'd buried to keep his ego satisfied for nearly half a century. When Tao stepped out of the bathroom and laid eyes on me fully styled, he froze mid-step, leather work shoes skinning on the tile floor. His gaze dragged over my outfit, the jewelry, the neat-styled hair, confusion mixing with faint, unrecognizable longing across his face. He'd never once asked me to dress nicely for him over our decades of marriage, always dismissing any attempt at self-care as wasteful vanity. Now he couldn't look away, struck by the realization he'd grown complacent with a stripped-back, utilitarian version of me that only existed to serve his routine. "You bought new clothes?" He fumbled the question, unable to mask the surprise in his voice. I grabbed a well-maintained brown leather handbag from the entryway hook, the bag a small luxury item I'd saved for over 3 years from sewing and food stall side income. This has been hanging in my closet for 8 years. I never had reason to wear it around the house before today. Xiao arrived 10 minutes later behind the wheel of her sedan, and we piled into the car, Tao slumping silently in the back passenger seat while I sat upright in the front passenger space. No conversation exchanged between us the entire drive to the Civil Affairs Bureau. The radio's upbeat traffic updates filled the uncomfortable silence, a stark contrast to the heavy tension thick inside the vehicle. I stared out the window at the old neighborhood apartment blocks we'd lived in together for decades, running a silent mental tally of every expense I'd single-handedly covered over the years. The 18,000 yuan housing reform down payment from my sold bridal gold, tutoring fees for both children earned through Donta-esque pancake stalls, hospital care costs for Tao's father, medical bills during his appendix surgery. Every line item was cataloged neatly in my locked green notebook, stored safely inside my handbag, waiting for the day I needed to lay every truth bare for our family to witness. We stepped up to the divorce processing counter 40 minutes later, signatures scrawled evenly across the legal separation forms to split all shared assets 50-50, as we'd agreed. The clerk printed 2 maroon-hued divorce booklets and slid them across the counter to us. I tucked mine securely into the leather handbag without a single glance back at Tao, while he clutched his booklet loosely in one palm, shoulders hunched forward, as if a critical structural support had been ripped out from under his frame. Back in the sedan post-filing, Xiao broke the heavy silence first, glancing over at me from the driver's seat. "Mom, how are you really feeling right now?" I tilted my head up to gaze at the sunlight filtering through the windshield, a quiet, genuine sense of calm settling deep in my chest. 10 years of suppressed hurt, quiet resentment, and unspoken sacrifice melted away in that single moment of finalized separation. I wasn't grief-stricken or bitter. I was unshackled. For the first time since I was 19 years old and walked down the aisle to marry him, I belonged solely to myself, no longer obligated to prioritize his comfort, his pride, or his fragile public reputation above my own well-being. Last night was the first full night of uninterrupted sleep I've had in 47 years. I told her plainly, no dramatic emotion swelling in my tone. I don't regret any of the hard work I put into this family, but I do regret wasting decades waiting for gratitude that was never coming. Tao's head snapped up from the back seat at those words, his eyes wide with stunned hurt, as if he genuinely believed all my labor was owed to him by default. He'd never once stopped to consider the scale of everything I'd sacrificed to build his stable, respected life, and the cold clarity of that realization hit him all at once as we pulled back into our old residential alleyway. We barely stepped foot inside the apartment and set our bags down when the doorbell blared nonstop, sharp, insistent chimes echoing through the narrow hallway. I opened the front door to find Tao Lei standing on the landing, black sedan parked haphazardly across 2 community parking spots downstairs, jaw set in an aggressive, judgmental line. He barely waited for me to step aside before storming into the living room, tossing his leather briefcase down hard onto the coffee table. "You couldn't even wait for me to drive over and talk this through before signing divorce papers?" He raised his voice loud enough to carry through the thin walls to the neighboring units, anger thick in every syllable. "Mom, you're pushing 70 years old. This is reckless, short-sighted. You didn't even hire a lawyer to review the asset division terms before putting pen to paper." I sank onto the sofa and gestured for him to sit across from me, remaining entirely calm despite his raised volume. My motive for patience simple. I needed him to fully expose his biased loyalty before laying out every documented sacrifice I'd logged over the past 47 years, so there would be no room for him to later claim I'd hidden the full truth from the family. I didn't act without forethought. I replied evenly. I agreed to a 50-50 split of all marital property, exactly as your father proposed this morning. Tao Lei scoffed loudly, crossing his arms over his chest, every mannerism mirroring Tao Jian's bureaucratic arrogance to a disturbing degree. This building is a work unit housing reform property originally allocated to Dad back in 1994. Its original purchase price was negligible. You can't pretend you're entitled to half the current market value of over 1,100,000 yuan just because you lived here with him. I watched his defensive posture carefully, noting how he instantly leaped to his father's defense without pausing to ask what financial contributions I'd made to the home's purchase. His blind loyalty stemmed from decades of conditioning. Tao Jian had always presented himself as the sole breadwinner and provider during family gatherings, while I remained the invisible housewife who never spoke of my off-hours side income or sold bridal jewelry to cover major family costs. "Let me ask you one direct question, Lei," I said, leaning forward slightly to lock eyes with him. "When we paid the 18,000 yuan lump sum to claim full ownership of this apartment during the housing reform period in 1994, where did that cash originate from?" Tao Lei's brows shot upward, thrown completely off guard by the question. He hesitated for several long seconds before fumbling a vague response. "Dad's monthly salary back then, I assume?" I shook my head once, slow and deliberate, and reached into my leather handbag to pull out a thick stack of faded paper receipts and handwritten payment slips, spreading them across the coffee table one by one for him to examine. Each slip bore my signature or the stamp of the second-hand jewelry shop where I'd sold my mother's wedding gold and silver heirlooms to raise the full down payment amount. "Your father's monthly salary back in 1994 only hit 320 yuan, I explained, tapping the top receipt with one finger. He couldn't scrape together 1,000 yuan in cash savings, let alone 18,000. I liquidated my bridal dowry precious metals to cover the entire housing fee, while he deposited every paycheck into a separate personal bank account and refused to contribute a single cent to household expenses for decades afterward. Tao Lei's mouth fell open, gaze darting over the yellowed, aged receipts scattered across the tabletop, every document tangible proof of a truth he never once suspected existed. Before he could formulate a rebuttal, I continued laying out every unacknowledged financial sacrifice chronologically. No raised voice, no emotional outburst, just cold, documented facts to dismantle the false narrative Tao had spent 47 years feeding our son. 2,200 yuan in combined middle school and high school tutoring fees for you and your sister Xiaoqing, earned over 3 straight years of Dawn Street pancake stalls, standing outside the campus in summer heat and winter wind to scrape together cash your father refused to cover. The kitchen and bathroom full remodel, new heating piping installation, 2 full roof repairs, all funded by my sewing and house cleaning side work, 0 contributions from his personal savings account. When he underwent emergency appendix surgery in 2002, I took a 30-day unpaid leave from my domestic service jobs to sleep on the hospital ward cot beside his bed. He didn't utter one word of gratitude upon discharge, just rushed off to take business calls with his work colleagues. Tao Lei's aggressive anger melted away entirely, replaced by a quiet, stunned shame as he processed the weight of every sacrifice I'd laid out in plain black and white paper evidence. He'd spent his whole life believing his father single-handedly carried our family's financial burden, blind to the invisible labor and self-sacrifice I'd quietly sustained behind closed doors. He opened his mouth to speak several times, yet no coherent sentence came out, every argument he'd prepared to lecture me vanishing entirely in the face of irrefutable physical proof laid across the coffee table between us. I closed the chapter's emotional beat with quiet resolve, watching him absorb the reality he'd spent 47 years willfully ignoring. Every comfort Tao Jian enjoyed over his career was built on the sacrifices I'd hidden from the entire family for half a century, and the 50-50 asset split I'd agreed to was already a generous concession on my part. Tao Lei sat frozen on the sofa for a solid 10 minutes after I laid out every aged receipt and dowry sales slip across the coffee table. His fingers hovered over the yellowed paperwork, but never dared touch any of it, like he was afraid the inked words would burn his skin. Every defensive line he'd rehearsed on the drive over, calls of recklessness, accusations I'd acted without a lawyer, lectures about prioritizing old age security, dissipated completely the second he realized how thoroughly his father had distorted our household's financial reality for 47 years. His core motive for rushing over that afternoon had been blind filial loyalty. He'd grown up saturated with Tao Jian's self-centered narrative that he alone bore the weight of our family's livelihood, and he'd never bothered to ask me a single follow-up question about where the constant household money actually came from. Now that the paper trail erased every lie his father had fed him, a heavy, awkward shame settled deep into his bones. I never knew any of this existed, he mumbled at last, voice thin and hoarse, eyes locked on the 1994 jewelry shop receipt sitting front and center of the stack. Dad always said his salary covered everything we needed. I just took it as fact, never thought to dig deeper. I folded my hands loosely in my lap, no trace of anger or triumph coloring my tone, only weary, long-suffering calm. My emotional shift here was quiet but definitive. I'd once hoped my son might notice my sacrifices and stand beside me, but that faint, lingering hope died in this living room, replaced by a clear understanding that he'd been fully conditioned to side with his father's ego above my humanity for his entire adult life. The front door's metal knocker banged 3 sharp, rapid times before Tao Lei could formulate another sentence. I pushed myself up off the sofa and crossed the narrow entry hallway, twisting the deadbolt open without hesitation. A woman around 56 years old stood on the concrete landing, her lipstick perfectly blended, a woven gift bag filled imported cherries clutched in one hand, her posture relaxed and self-righteous, like she held full authority to step into my marital home and negotiate terms on my husband's behalf. "Hello, you must be Yufeng," she said, her tone sweet yet laced with quiet condescension, stepping forward uninvited before I could block the threshold. "I'm Lu Guifeng. I've been spending time with Jian from the Community Calligraphy Club for nearly a year now." Tao Lei shot straight to his feet the second the name registered, his jaw tightening hard enough to strain the muscles along his cheeks. He'd heard his father casually mention Lu in passing weeks prior, but Tao Jian had framed their bond as nothing more than platonic hobby acquaintances, never hinting at a romantic entanglement built on my husband's lies about a loveless 47-year marriage. Who said you could just show up unannounced at this hour? Tao lay challenged, stepping between Lu and me to block her path deeper into the apartment. This is my parents' private residence. You've got no business intruding like this. Lu brushed his arm aside with a dismissive flick of her wrist, her gaze sliding past him to lock directly on me, zero attempt to hide the underlying agenda she'd traveled here to push. I didn't come to argue. I just wanted to clear the air between us. Jen's told me how upset you are about the divorce settlement, and I'm here to ask you to soften your demands a little. He's retired on a fixed pension. He can't afford to lose half this house and all his savings, not with me planning to move in and care for him long term. I leaned against the doorframe, studying her carefully, without rushing to snap back or raise my voice. My motive for staying composed was tactical restraint. I needed to let her fully lay out her own biased narrative first, every entitled demand and false sympathy on full display, before I countered with factual context to dismantle her entire pre-planned talking points. Every word she volunteered would become witness evidence later, for neighbors and family to hear when I laid out the full scope of both Tao and her coordinated deception. Care for him. I repeated the phrase slowly, a faint, dry smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. You plan to move into the home I funded with my sole bridal dowry, to live off the assets I built over decades of off-hours labor? That's quite a generous ask, considering you only entered the picture once our marriage had already crumbled entirely thanks to his secret affairs. Lu's easy smile faltered for half a second, but she recovered fast, doubling down on her manufactured victim act. You're 70 years old with grown children who can support you. Jian's only source of income is his monthly retirement check. It's unfair to split everything evenly when you've got family safety nets he doesn't have anymore. Tao lay spun to face me, caught between sudden recognition of his father's betrayal and the ingrained urge to defend his parents' reputation in front of a stranger. Mom, maybe we can talk through a compromise for everyone's sake? I shook my head once, firm and unyielding. There's no compromise to reach. We already signed legally binding paperwork at the Civil Affairs Bureau this morning, splitting all marital assets 50-50. That agreement stands, and I won't renegotiate a single clause for anyone's convenience, least of all a stranger who's counting on my 47 years of sacrifice for her own comfortable retirement. Lu's polite mask slipped completely at my refusal, her voice sharpening into a sharp, defensive snap. You're being bitter and unreasonable over a finished marriage. Jian's lonely after decades of quiet neglect from you. I'm the only person who truly understands what he's going through right now. I gestured to the sofa behind us, inviting her inside to sit if she intended to continue the conversation, fully aware every line she spoke would be witnessed by Tao Lei and used to expose her manipulative priorities later. Come in and say everything you've prepared to tell me. I'll listen fully before I respond, no interruptions. She hesitated for a beat, then marched past Tao into the living room, setting the fruit bag down heavy on the coffee table right atop my stack of financial receipts, as if her trivial luxury gift could outweigh 47 years of my documented labor. She sank onto the opposite end of the sofa from where I sat, crossing her legs and launching into a rehearsed monologue designed to paint herself as the compassionate savior rescuing Tao from a cold, ungrateful wife. I don't own a house of my own, Lu admitted offhand mid-sentence, not realizing how the line exposed every self-serving layer of her supposed devoted companionship. My pension's only $2,800 a month, barely enough to cover rent and daily groceries. If Jian loses half his home and all his joint savings in the split, I'll have nowhere stable to live out my later years with him. You can't honestly be willing to ruin two people's futures just to hold onto resentment from the past. Tao Lei's head shot up at that admission, shock flooding his features. He'd bought into the soft, caring companion persona Tao had painted of Lu for months, never once suspecting housing security was her primary driving factor for pursuing a relationship with a wealthy retired cadre. He glanced between her pleading face and the pile of my housing down payment receipts resting inches from her fruit bag, the full contrast between her urgent financial need and my decades of uncompensated sacrifice crashing over him all at once. I held Lu's gaze steady, every word delivered slow and deliberate, no raised volume needed to cut through her performative sorrow. So your attachment to him boils down to a roof over your head, not genuine care for who he is as a person? That tracks perfectly with everything I've learned about how you two orchestrated this whole situation over the past year. Lu's cheeks flushed bright red, panic flickering across her features as she realized she'd accidentally exposed her core financial motive without filtering her words first. She scrambled to backtrack immediately, rushing to patch the damage with rapid, contradictory excuses. That's not what I meant at all. I care deeply about Jian's well-being first and foremost. Housing's just a minor practical detail that comes along with building a life together. I pulled my mobile phone out of my crossbody bag, tapping open the photo album folder holding all the documentation I'd collected over the prior 10 years, starting with the 2014 photograph of Tao and his first secret subordinate lover, then moving to bank records of my long-term side income, housing purchase proof, and witness statements from neighbors who'd watched me shoulder every household burden alone. I held the screen up, so both Lu and Tao Lei could clearly view the images lined up in sequence. Minor practical detail? I repeated, letting the question hang heavy in the air. For 47 years, I put every roof, every meal, every medical bill, every educational cost on my own shoulders so he could focus on his career and hobby calligraphy without a single financial worry. Now you arrive a year after he grew bored of our quiet life and expect me to hand over half of what I built so you don't have to struggle with rent? The math doesn't add up, no matter how many emotional lines you rehearse to sway strangers. Lou's hands twisted together tight in her lap, her confident posture collapsing inward as she struggled to find a counterargument that wouldn't further reveal her self-interest. She fell silent for nearly a full minute, the only sound in the room the soft tick of my 30-year-old wall clock hanging above the TV cabinet. Tao did not step in to defend her this time. He sat rigid on the edge of the sofa, processing how thoroughly both his father and this woman had colluded to extract value from the life I'd single-handedly constructed. After the quiet stretch passed, Lou attempted to pivot tactics entirely, shifting from financial pleading to moral guilt-tripping directed at Tao instead of me, hoping to sway him into mediating a softer asset split on her behalf. Your son must see how unfair this whole arrangement is, surely. You've got a comfortable home of your own with your spouse and child, secure savings built from 2 steady careers. Jian's entire future stability hangs on whether he retains full control of this apartment and his life savings. Tao Lei finally spoke up, his tone flat and stripped of all prior partiality toward his father's side. The apartment's half Mom's by legal right, and every cent of the original purchase price came from her sold bridal jewelry. If Dad wants to keep the full property, he'd need to pay her the full market valuation of half the home up front. That's not an unfair ask. It's basic legal and financial fairness. Lou stared at him in stunned disbelief, clearly counting on his automatic loyalty to Tao Jian to override any factual evidence laid out before them. She'd fully anticipated leveraging their shared family bond to pressure me into concessions, never accounting for the stack of tangible proof that would force even Tao Lei to abandon his father's one-sided narrative. Lou slammed her canvas tote bag shut and stood abruptly, her movements sharp and agitated as she stepped toward the entry hallway, no more polite pretense left to uphold. This conversation's pointless if you refuse to meet us halfway. I'll let Jian handle formal negotiations with a lawyer instead. There's no reason for me to waste my breath trying to reason with someone who's locked into bitter resentment. She didn't spare another glance at either of us as she yanked the front door open hard enough to rattle the metal frame, her footsteps pounding fast down the concrete stairwell until the sound faded into the distant hum of the neighborhood street. Silence reclaimed the living room for a long stretch after her exit. Tao Lei stared at the scattered financial receipts covering the coffee table, his expression heavy with a complicated mix of embarrassment and remorse he'd never displayed prior to this afternoon's revelations. He twisted his wedding band around his finger repeatedly, a nervous habit I recognized from his teenage years when he'd hid mistakes from our family to avoid confrontation. Mom, I need to tell you something I've kept from you for almost 8 months, he said at last, voice barely above a quiet mumble, eyes fixed on the floor instead of meeting my gaze. Dad would leave the office early every Wednesday and Friday afternoon to meet Lou at her rental apartment or the community activity hall. He'd text me beforehand to warn him not to mention it if I ran into you around the neighborhood, and I went along with it to keep peace in the family. I thought it was just a fleeting midlife distraction that would burn out fast, didn't realize he planned to file divorce and fight you over the house because of her. This confession landed heavier than any of Lou's entitled demands had, a fresh wave of muted grief settling over my chest. My core emotional shift hit a permanent turning point in this moment. I'd already written off Tao Jian entirely after the divorce paperwork was signed that morning, but a tiny fragment of hope had lingered that my son would choose honesty and my well-being over shielding his father's selfish secrets. That last thin thread of familial hope snapped completely as I processed his admission. He'd watched me carry 47 years of hardship alone, yet still chose to hide his father's ongoing affair rather than spare me further deception and heartbreak. I don't blame you for being afraid of family friction, I told him, no anger in my voice, only hollow, exhausted acceptance. But I won't pretend it doesn't hurt to know you had months of advance warning about everything he planned, and chose to keep me in the dark rather than give me time to prepare solid legal evidence ahead of his divorce demand. Tao Lei's shoulders slumped forward, every trace of the defensive, entitled attitude he'd walked in with gone without a trace. I was cowardly, plain and simple. I didn't want to be the one to break the news and spark a huge household fight, so I buried my head in the sand and pretended none of it was happening. That was unforgivably selfish of me, and I'm sorry I let you walk into this blindsided. I stood from the sofa and began gathering the aged receipts and paperwork scattered across the table, stacking them neatly back into the brown archival envelope I kept locked in my bedroom nightstand for safekeeping. Every piece of paper represented a year of sacrifice, a secret I'd carried alone for decades, now fully exposed to the one person who'd been meant to stand beside me through hardship. I accept your apology, I said, sliding the full stack back into the envelope and sealing the flap tight, but don't expect me to erase what you've hidden from me over these months overnight. It'll take time to untangle how all these layers of deception stacked on top of each other. Tao Lei rose to his feet, hovering in the middle of the living room, unsure if he should linger or take his leave now that our tense conversation had run its course. He hesitated a moment longer before speaking again, a quiet, tentative offer hanging in the air. If you need me to act as a witness to any of this documentation in court or during community discussions later, I'll show up without hesitation. I won't shield Dad's lies any longer now that I've seen the full truth of everything you've endured. I nodded once in acknowledgement, watching him grab his briefcase and walk slowly toward the front door, his steps far heavier than they'd been upon arrival earlier that afternoon. The apartment fell quiet again once the door clicked shut behind him, leaving only the steady tick of my old wall clock to fill the empty space. I sank back onto the sofa alone, staring at the fruit bag Lou had abandoned on the table, the imported cherries inside a hollow symbol of the shallow luxury she'd chased at the cost of my 47 years of life's labor. No more desperate bargaining. No more half-truths hidden by my own blood family. No more strangers stepping into my home to demand I surrender what I'd earned through sacrifice. The first major chapter of my long overdue liberation was fully complete, and the next phase, laying out every secret to the full community of retired cadres and neighbors who'd bought into Tao Jian's polished public persona, was already waiting on the horizon. The banquet hall of the old downtown restaurant hummed with soft chatter when I pushed open the glass entrance door. All tables were filled with retired teachers, bureau staff, and their spouses, people who'd listened to Tao boast for 40 years about his successful career and stable, obedient housewife, without knowing the full cost I'd paid for his reputation. Tao sat at the central round table, the seat of honor reserved for former department leaders, Lou pressed tight against his side. She wore a cream silk blouse and delicate gold jewelry, grinning and accepting small compliments from the men around her like she'd already replaced me in every social circle. No one at the table had any idea her whole plan hinged on stealing half my marital property, nor that she'd lied about her personal housing stability just weeks prior. Tao's gaze snapped to me the second I stepped inside the room. A flicker of raw panic crossed his face, quickly masked by forced calm. He'd assumed I would be too ashamed or grief-stricken to show my face at a public event where he'd brought his lover. Lou's smile faltered too, her fingers tightening around Tao's forearm as she shot me a sharp, wary glance. I did not hurry over to argue or raise my voice. I simply pulled out an empty seat at the far end of the main table, sat down slowly, and rested a thick leather portfolio folder on the tabletop beside my teacup. Every person within 10 feet tracked that plain dark folder with quiet curiosity, sensing it held something life-altering for Tao's polished public persona. An old coworker named he sat across from me, clearing his throat to break the awkward silence. Yufeng, it's good to see you out after all this time. We've all heard bits and pieces of what's been going on between you and Jian, but no one's gotten the full story yet. I nodded politely, folding my hands atop the folder without opening it just yet. I haven't come here to start a fight or drag anyone through mud. I only want to set the record straight for every person who's listened to his version of our 47-year marriage for decades. Tao's jaw locked hard, cutting in before I could continue. There's no need to air private family business in front of everyone here. We already signed legal divorce paperwork. The asset split is finalized. This conversation has no place at a friendly retiree gathering. His tone carried the same authoritarian director's voice he'd used to shut down subordinates for 30 years, a tone he'd never once directed at me during our marriage unless I dared question his choices. But this time, the crowd did not automatically defer to him. Several elderly women at the neighboring tables exchanged quiet, knowing looks, recalling countless times I'd attended events alone while Tao socialized without me. I tilted my head toward him, speaking at a measured volume everyone in the room could hear clearly. Private business? You brought your new partner to a public dinner meant for long-term colleagues, openly replacing me in front of every person we've known for half our lives. You turned our 47-year partnership into public spectacle first. I'm only matching your transparency, nothing more. Lou opened her mouth to snap a defensive retort, but Tao squeezed her wrist hard onto the table, signaling her to stay silent for the moment. He feared if she spoke, she would accidentally spill details of her financial motives and fabricated backstory, unraveling the thin, sympathetic act they built together. I dragged the zipper down the portfolio's edge, sliding stacks of aged yellow receipts, bound notebook pages, and printed digital screenshots across the polished wooden table one by one, arranging them in a clear timeline for everyone to read. I did not yell, cry, or add dramatic commentary. I let the physical evidence speak entirely for itself, letting the crowd parse every fact without emotional bias from me. 1994 housing reform down payment receipt, 18,000 yuan, all funds from my mother's wedding dowry gold and silver heirlooms I liquidated myself. Tao's monthly salary at that time was only 320 yuan. He could not contribute a single cent to the home we lived in for 26 years. I tapped the faded jewelry shop receipt with one finger, letting the table pass the paper around for all to examine. A murmur rippled through the room, growing louder as each attendee read the handwritten transaction record. Tao's face drained of all color, his shoulders slumping forward onto the table surface, every trace of his usual bureaucratic confidence vanishing completely. Lou's cheeks burned bright red, staring down at her lap to avoid the dozens of judgmental eyes fixed on her. I continued laying out each layer of hidden sacrifice without pause. 1998 middle and high school tuition records for our two children, two separate lump sums totaling 14,000 yuan, earned over 3 straight summers and winters selling pancakes at the school gate before dawn and after dark. All household utility bills, kitchen renovations, roof repairs, and medical care costs for his father and his own appendix surgery. Every major expense covered by my off hours, sewing, and house cleaning side work, while Tao deposited every official paycheck into a private account he never shared with our family. I pulled out printed screenshots next. The chat logs from my neighbor An Jiang's witness testimony about Lou's financial desperation and her plan to seize Tao's half of the marital property. This is a verbatim record from a conversation between Lou and her own younger brother, captured by a nearby resident who overheard them outside my building. Her exact words: "Figure out exactly how much savings and property Jian holds before we lock down a permanent place to live." She admitted to me 3 days prior that her personal pension cannot cover basic rent costs, and her entire motivation for pursuing a relationship was securing housing stability through Tao's assets. I finished by opening the thick green handwritten notebook I'd maintained for 10 years after discovering his first extramarital photo back in 2014, sliding the open pages across the table for everyone to scan the daily logs of unacknowledged labor and quiet heartbreak I'd endured alone. I did not confront him for a full decade after finding proof of his first affair. I did not scream, beg, or threaten divorce. I simply logged every sacrifice and every lie, waiting for the day he chose to end our marriage of his own accord, just as he did on dumpling night weeks ago. The banquet hall fell utterly silent for nearly a full minute. Every former coworker, neighbor, and spouse stared at the piles of physical proof scattered across the table, processing the reality that the respected retired bureau director they'd admired for decades had built his comfortable, prestigious life entirely on his wife's unseen sacrifice, then discarded her the second a new woman with financial motives appeared. He tried to interject, voice shaky and thin. "This is all taken out of context. You're twisting minor household expenses to paint me as a terrible person." I cut him off gently, no malice in my tone, only plain factual certainty. Context is written on every receipt, every notebook page, every witness statement laid out before you all. There is no room for misinterpretation here. Aunt Zhang, the retired community women's liaison who'd long been my loyal confidant, stood up from a side table and walked over to rest a hand on my shoulder, addressing the whole room directly. "I've watched Yufeng's life unfold for 26 years in this residential complex. I've seen her stand outside in freezing winter wind flipping pancake griddles at 7 a.m. I've helped her carry heavy sacks of flour home after work, while Tao spent every evening at calligraphy club banquets and social events. None of what she's shared tonight is exaggerated. Every hardship I've witnessed firsthand." Her third-party witness testimony sealed the shift in public opinion. Where the room had once been split between neutrality and mild sympathy for Tao, every single attendee now viewed him as a selfish man who'd taken decades of unreciprocated care for granted, then abandoned his wife to chase a woman solely after his property and pension. Lou stood up abruptly, grabbing her handbag and rushing toward the exit without a single word, too ashamed to remain seated amid the crowd's silent condemnation. Tao made no move to chase her, sitting hunched at the table alone, abandoned by the companion he'd chosen over 47 years of marriage. A full 30 days passed after the cadre dinner, and I poured all my spare time into preparing a personal calligraphy showcase hosted at the District Cultural Center. I practiced running script every morning for 8 years in secret while Tao slept in, never once showing him the finished pieces. He'd always dismissed my hobby as trivial, unworthy of comparison to his own award-winning brushwork. My entry piece was a large vertical scroll inked with just 2 characters, Zizai, freedom. The strokes were clean, unburdened, no heavy restraint in each line, a visual reflection of the peace I had gained after ending the marriage and stepping out from under 47 years of invisible servitude. The exhibition opening day drew dozens of community seniors, Aunt Zhang, and my new calligraphy mentor Master Fong arriving early to help hang my scrolls on the gallery walls. I wore the burgundy knit cardigan I bought the day we filed for divorce, the pearl studs still clipped to my earlobes, calm and at ease as guests stopped to compliment my brush technique. Halfway through the afternoon visiting hours, the gallery entrance door creaked open, and Tao shuffled inside alone, no Lou at his side, his hair uncombed, eyes sunken with exhaustion, clutching a rolled rice paper scroll tight in both hands. He hesitated a few feet from my display wall, waiting until the other guests stepped away before stepping forward to speak to me directly, his voice hoarse and weak, stripped of all former director arrogance. "Yufeng, I came to say what I couldn't at the dinner, and I read every notebook page, every receipt Lei showed me after that night. I understand now how much I took for granted every single year we were together. This scroll's for you. I wrote it over 12 tries before I got the characters right." He unrolled the paper between us, too shaky, uneven lines of black ink scrawled across the blank page. 47 years. You carried our family. I'm truly sorry. I glanced at the scroll for several quiet seconds, acknowledging the apology, without softening my resolve to fully cut ties. My core motive for refusing any form of reconciliation was rooted in the irreversible shift of my inner identity. I was no longer the quiet, accommodating housewife who would overlook endless self-centered neglect just to maintain a fragile family facade. I'd built my own stable life, my own hobbies, my own independent home, and I had no desire to step back into the same cycle of sacrifice and unappreciation ever again. I handed the scroll back to him without accepting it into my grasp. "I've read every proof of your choices over 47 years, Tao. I accept your apology, but an apology does not erase 47 years of disregard, nor the last 10 years of hidden affairs and calculated deception. I don't hate you anymore, but I don't belong beside you either." Tao's hands trembled as he folded the scroll back up, desperation flooding his features. "We have our son, our granddaughter. Can we not at least rebuild a quiet companionship for our old age? I'll never seek another woman again. I'll learn to cook, handle all household work myself." I shook my head once, slow and definitive, cutting off his pleading before he could continue listing empty promises. Companionship requires mutual respect and equal sacrifice. We never had that balance, and we can't rewrite 47 years of one-sided labor to create it now. I'm happy living independently with my art, my friends, my own home. I don't need a partner to fill empty space anymore. Master Fong walked over to my side as Tao stood frozen, unable to find another argument to sway me. placing a supportive hand on my upper arm. Her brushwork tells everything you need to see. This woman writes freedom from the heart, and Owen should ask her to cage herself again after breaking free. Tal lingered for 5 more silent minutes before turning to walk out of the gallery hall, the unaccepted apology scroll tucked tight under his arm, alone and stripped of every social prestige he'd spent his whole life chasing. I turned back to my exhibition wall, staring at the large freedom scroll hanging front and center, a quiet, genuine smile spreading across my face. For the first time in nearly 7 decades, I lived solely for myself, no one else's expectations weighing on my shoulders. 5 years after the divorce, I own a fully paid 97 square meter apartment in a quiet new complex, all funds saved from my decades of side labor and art competition rewards. Every morning I walk the park to practice calligraphy on stone slabs with water brushes, spend afternoons in a community art class with a circle of loyal, genuine female friends, and write one small happy memory each night in a brand new notebook. No more logs of suffering, only small, gentle joys I create for myself. My grandson visits every weekend, drawing pictures of me standing in front of my scrolls, saying his grandmother is the bravest person he knows. Tal lives alone in the old 80-square marital house we split evenly, learning to cook simple meals from online tutorials, surviving on his pension with no one to tend his daily needs. Lou's scheme collapsed completely after her past multiple marriages and asset fraud were exposed across every senior community group. She fled the city to a distant small town, with no more elderly targets she could manipulate for housing and money. My son, Tal, lay fully changed his priorities after witnessing all the evidence, splitting household chores evenly with his wife and regularly bringing his daughter over to spend time with me, finally understanding the weight of the labor I carried alone for most of my life. No more hidden debts, no unspoken sacrifices, no men who view me as disposable domestic support to discard once a newer, self-serving partner appears. I stand on my own balcony each autumn evening, watching the sunset paint the sky soft gold, holding a cup of warm jasmine tea in my hands, completely at peace. Every hardship of the past 4 decades led me to this quiet, unshakable freedom, the ultimate victory I earned through decades of quiet patience, careful truth-gathering, and unyielding self-respect. End of entire novel.